The day we buried Carol, I came home and sat in her garden for 2 hours talking to her tomato plants. She would have laughed at me for that. She always said I was terrible at growing things, that I had what she called the opposite of a green thumb. She wasn't wrong. In 39 years of marriage, I killed every houseplant she ever trusted me with. But that afternoon in September, I sat on the old wooden bench she'd built herself. Carol was better with tools than I ever was, and I talked to those plants like they could hear me. I told them she was gone. I told them I didn't know what to do with the silence inside the house. I told them I was sorry I never learned which ones needed more water and which ones needed less. I was 63 years old and I had no idea how to be alone. Carol had been the kind of woman who filled rooms without trying to, not loud, not demanding, just present in a way that made you feel like wherever she was, that was the right place to be. We'd met at a conference in Chicago, both of us 30-something, and pretending to care about a panel discussion on regional land development. She was sitting 2 seats down from me, and at some point she leaned over and whispered that the moderator was putting her to sleep. I told her I'd been asleep for 20 minutes already. She laughed so hard she had to cover her mouth with her program. We had dinner that night. We were married 11 months later. 39 years. You don't just lose a person after 39 years. You lose a language. The heart attack had been fast, which her doctor said was a mercy, though I wasn't sure I agreed with him. She'd been healthy enough. 61 years old, no major conditions, blood pressure a little high, but managed. She was carrying groceries in from the car on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, and by the time I heard the bags hit the floor and got to the kitchen, she was already on the ground. The paramedics were kind. There was nothing anyone could have done. I have heard those words so many times since then that they have started to sound like a foreign language. Our son Brandon flew in from Dallas the morning after. He was 38, worked in finance, wore his suits like armor. He had Carol's eyes and none of her warmth, which is a combination I had spent years trying to make my peace with. His wife Tammy came with him, a small, watchful woman who smiled a lot without it ever quite reaching her eyes. They stayed through the funeral, and 3 days after, on the second day, while Carol's sister and a few neighbors were still in the house eating casseroles, Brandon sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Dad, we should probably talk about the house." I looked at him. "Just in terms of what makes sense going forward," he said. "A 4-bedroom house is a lot to maintain alone. Property taxes here aren't cheap. It might be worth thinking about." I said I'd think about it. He nodded in a way that told me he'd already done the thinking. I didn't say anything else. Carol always said I had a gift for waiting, that I could hold on to a silence longer than anyone she'd ever met. She meant it as a compliment, mostly. I sat with that silence now and let Brandon fill it with talk about market conditions and equity and assisted living communities that are actually really nice, Dad, not what you're picturing. I listened. I nodded. I didn't argue because I didn't have the energy to argue, and also because I have lived long enough to know that when someone shows you who they are, the correct response is not to argue with them. The correct response is to pay attention. They went back to Dallas. The house went quiet. In October, Brandon called twice a week. The calls always started with, "How was I doing? How was I sleeping? Had I been getting out of the house?" And then, gently, inevitably, circled back to the house itself. Had I thought more about it? Had I talked to a realtor? There was nothing wrong with downsizing. It was the practical thing. He and Tammy had looked into a few places in a retirement community outside of Scottsdale, which was only 2 hours from Dallas. Wouldn't that be convenient? I listened. I said I was still thinking. In November, he asked me to consider signing a document that would give him a limited power of attorney over my finances. "Just while you're grieving, Dad, just so someone responsible has an eye on things." He said it gently, and I believe he even meant part of it, but I remembered what Carol used to say about Brandon. She used to say, "He loves you, Jim. He just loves what things are worth a little more than he loves what things mean." She had a way of being exactly right about people without enjoying it at all. I didn't sign the document. I told him I'd talk to my own attorney first. There was a pause on the phone that was longer than it should have been, and then he said, of course, that made total sense. He just wanted to help. I said I knew that. We said goodbye. In the first week of November, about 10 weeks after Carol died, I got a letter in the mail. The return address was a law firm in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, a name I didn't recognize. I almost set it aside. I'd been setting aside a lot of mail since September, letting it accumulate on the kitchen counter while I worked up the energy to deal with it. But something made me open this one that same afternoon, standing at the counter in my coat because I hadn't bothered to take it off after coming in from the mailbox. Inside was a letter from an attorney named Patricia O.C. It was 2 pages long, typed on good paper, and it began, "Dear Mr. Calloway, your wife, Carol Ann Calloway, retained this firm in February of this year to execute a series of arrangements she asked us to hold in confidence until 10 weeks following her passing. She asked that this letter be delivered to you at that time. Enclosed, please find the relevant documents and a personal letter written in her hand." I sat down at the kitchen table. Carol's letter was 4 pages, front and back, written on the yellow legal pad paper she'd used since I'd known her. Her handwriting was exactly the same as it always had been, looping and slightly left-leaning, the way it looked on every grocery list and birthday card and note she'd ever left me. She started by saying she was sorry I was reading it. She said she hoped it was a very long time before I was reading it, years and years, and that she was sorry if it wasn't. She said she had not told me about any of this while she was alive, because she knew I would have argued with her about it, and she was right about that. She said that in 39 years of watching people, she had learned 2 things: that love required preparation, and that some people only showed you their true nature when money entered the room. She had been watching Brandon for a long time. She said she wasn't angry at him. She said she understood how he got that way. The private school, the finance world, the wife who measured everything in square footage. She said she loved him and always would. But she also said she had lain awake enough nights worrying about what would happen to me after she was gone, that she had decided to do something about it. In February, 7 months before the heart attack no one had predicted, no one had planned for, Carol had quietly taken $290,000 from a savings account she'd built over 15 years. Money she'd saved from her consulting work that I had never paid much attention to because Carol handled our finances the way she handled everything, which was competently and without requiring my input. She had purchased, in cash, a small craftsman cottage on 4 acres in the Berkshires in a town called Monterey, Massachusetts, an hour and a half from our house. She had registered the property under a trust in her name, structured in a way that transferred to me directly upon her death, outside of the standard probate process. She had also set aside an additional $47,000 in a separate account designated solely for property maintenance, taxes, and anything else I might need in the first few years. She had done all of this quietly, methodically, without saying a word to me, because she knew I would have told her she was being dramatic, and that Brandon would never do what she suspected he might do. "I know you, Jim," she wrote. "You always want to believe the best of people. It's one of the things I love most about you, and one of the things that makes me most nervous. So I did this instead. Think of it as me loving you from a distance." She wrote that the cottage was small, but that it had a covered porch facing east, toward the hills, and that she had only seen it once in person. But that it had felt right to her. She wrote that the town was quiet, and that there was a farmer's market on Saturdays and a library she thought I would like. She wrote that she had left the key with Patricia O.C., along with a short set of instructions for the property. She wrote that she was not telling me to leave, only that she wanted me to have somewhere to go if I needed it. She ended the letter the way she ended almost every note she ever left me, the same way she'd been ending them since we were first married, and she used to leave notes on my pillow when she traveled for work. "I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. Don't forget to water the plants." I folded the letter. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A car went by on the street outside. I looked at Carol's chair across from me, the one she'd always sat in, the one with the slight wobble in the left back leg that I'd been meaning to fix for 6 years. And I did not try to hold anything back. I cried for about 40 minutes. I'm not ashamed of that. After 39 years, you're allowed. I called Patricia O.C. the next morning. She was professional and warm, and she spoke about Carol in the past tense with a gentleness that told me they'd had real conversations. She confirmed everything in the letter. She told me the property was in good condition, that Carol had arranged for a local handyman to do a walkthrough and a minor maintenance check in the spring. She said whenever I was ready, she could meet me at the cottage with the key. I told her I was ready that Saturday. The drive to Monterey took me through towns I'd never paid much attention to before, through hills that had already gone full autumn color and were now mostly bare, the trees standing clean and dark against a November sky. I had the address on my phone, but I didn't really need it after the first turn off the main road. There was only one lane that wound up into the trees the way Patricia's directions described. The cottage was small, like Carol had said, white clapboard siding, a dark green door, a stone chimney on the east side. The covered porch was exactly as she described it, facing east toward a long slope of field that ended at a wood line, maybe 300 yards out. There was a stone path from the porch steps down to what had once been a kitchen garden, now grown over for the season, but clearly laid out with intention. Patricia handed me the key. I stood on that porch for a long time, just looking out at the field. The air smelled like cold wood smoke and something earthy I couldn't name. A hawk was circling over the tree line in long, slow loops. I thought about Carol in February, standing here, making a decision without telling me about it. I thought about her walking this porch, looking at that same field, thinking about me. I went inside. The cottage had 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen with good light, and a living room with built-in bookshelves along the entire east wall. Someone, Carol, probably through Patricia's firm, had left a small stack of firewood by the hearth and a box of matches on the mantel. On the kitchen counter, there was a handwritten note in Carol's yellow legal pad handwriting that said simply, "The bedroom closet sticks. Lift and pull. Love you." I stood in that kitchen and laughed for the first time since August. I drove back home that evening with something I hadn't felt in 10 weeks. I wasn't sure what to call it exactly. There wasn't happiness. It was too small and quiet for that. But it was something. A direction, maybe. The sense that even after everything, someone had thought about what came next and had left me a path. Brandon called in the second week of November. He was in good spirits, which I had come to understand meant he'd been thinking. He said he'd talked to a realtor just to get a sense of things, Dad, not anything official, and that the house was worth considerably more than either of us had probably realized. He said the market in our area was strong. He said this in the careful way of someone who has prepared a conversation in advance. I asked him what he was suggesting. He said, and here his voice took on the particular tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable, that it might make sense to list the house in the spring, that he and Tammy had done some research into that Scottsdale community, and it really was excellent, that he could fly up in January to help me start going through things. I said that was thoughtful of him. He said he'd been looking into the process of listing me on some of their investment accounts as well, just so there was some continuity in management. He said Tammy's brother worked in wealth management and could be a real resource. I said I'd think about it. Then I told him I had to go and wished him a good evening. I spent the next 3 weeks making decisions. I spoke to my own attorney, a woman named Janet who had handled our wills for years and who had, it turned out, been part of the conversation with Patricia Osei in a limited capacity because Carol had been thorough about these things. Janet helped me understand exactly where everything stood. The house was mine. The cottage was mine. The accounts were mine. Everything Carol had arranged was clean and properly documented. There was nothing Brandon could do about any of it without my signature, which he was not going to get. I also started packing. Not frantically. Carefully. I took my time. I moved through the house over several weeks, deciding what mattered and what didn't. I kept Carol's good tools and her garden journals and the print she'd bought on our trip to New Mexico in 2011. I kept the kitchen table with the wobble in the leg. I arranged for a moving company to bring everything up to Monterey in the second week of December. I called Patricia Osei and made sure everything at the cottage was in order. I did not call Brandon. This was not cruelty. I want to be clear about that. I had spent 63 years trying not to be cruel. But I had also spent 63 years trying not to be foolish, and there are moments when those two things require the same action, which is simply, do what needs to be done and don't announce it in advance. The movers came on a Thursday. By Friday evening, the cottage in Monterey had my furniture in it, my books on the built-in shelves, Carol's garden journals on the nightstand in the smaller bedroom, and the kitchen table, wobble and all, sitting under the east-facing window where the morning light came in long and yellow across the wood floor. I left the house in proper order. I notified the post office of my new address. I called the neighbor across the street, a woman named Gert, who had brought us soup after Carol died and who I trusted, and I told her where I was going and left her my new number. On Saturday morning, before I left for the last time, I went out to Carol's garden. Everything was dead back for the winter, the way gardens go in New England. Brown and pulled in and quiet, but not gone. I could see where she'd marked the beds with small stakes and twine. I could see the careful rows, the evidence of all that attention. I told the garden I was going to try. I told it I couldn't promise I'd be any good at it, but I was going to try. I drove to Monterey with Carol's last note on the passenger seat, the one she'd left on the kitchen counter. The bedroom closet sticks. Lift and pull. Love you. I'd been at the cottage for 9 days when Brandon called. He had tried the house phone first, he said. He'd called twice and no one answered. He'd been about to call Gerd when he thought to try my cell. His voice had a new quality to it, something tighter, less prepared. I told him I wasn't at the house. He asked where I was. I told him I was at a property Carol had left me, up in the Berkshires. I told him I had moved. I told him the house was still mine and I had no intention of selling it at this time, but that I was no longer living there. There was a silence on the phone that lasted longer than any silence I'd heard from him before. He said, "What property?" I told him Carol had purchased it some time ago and left it to me in trust. I told him it was properly documented and that my attorney had all the details if he had questions. I told him the house back home was not for sale, but that he was welcome to visit any time he came east, as it would remain exactly as it was. He said, "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that question for a moment. I thought about Carol in February, standing on this porch, looking out at the field, making her preparations without announcing them. I thought about 39 years of someone who understood, better than I did, what love actually required. I said, "Your mother taught me that the things worth protecting are worth protecting quietly." He didn't have an answer for that. We talked for a few more minutes, nothing of substance, just the language families use when they're resetting. He was not, when it came down to it, a bad person. He was a person shaped by different values than the ones Carol and I had tried to give him, and that is a grief of its own kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself but sits quietly in the background of every conversation. I loved him the way you love someone you can't quite reach. I expected I always would. After we hung up, I went out to the porch. It was the 3rd week of December, cold and very still. The field out front had a skin of frost on it, and the wood line was dark against a sky that was going gray toward evening. I had a cup of coffee and a jacket that wasn't quite warm enough, which Carol would have had something to say about. I stayed out there longer than was probably smart, until the first few stars came through over the eastern hills. I had been thinking about what to do with the kitchen garden when spring came. I'd bought a book on it. A thick, serious book with diagrams and soil tables and whole chapters on companion planting. The kind of book Carol would have read cover to cover and I would have skimmed and then asked her to explain. I'd been reading it slowly, the way I do things when they matter, learning what needs more water and what needs less, learning what grows well next to what. I was 63 years old, and I was, for the first time in a long time, looking forward to something. The stars got brighter as the sky got darker. From somewhere down in the tree line, something called an owl, I thought, though I couldn't be sure. I answered it anyway. Carol always said I was too dignified to make animal noises into the dark. She was right about a lot of things. I went back inside, put another log on the fire, and sat down in the chair by the window, the one I'd moved from home, the one that had been next to Carol's chair for 30 years. I opened the gardening book to the chapter on soil preparation. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the frost was coming down slowly across the field, the whole 4 acres of it, all mine, all quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't empty but full of something I didn't have the words for exactly, but that I recognized. I have been here 3 months now. The bedroom closet still sticks. Every morning I lift and pull, and every morning I think of the woman who left me that note, who knew that I would be here doing exactly this, who prepared that for me in advance, who knew that what love looks like in the long run isn't grand gestures, but small, specific, practical kindnesses. A note about a sticking door, a cottage facing east, 4 acres in a town she'd only visited once, but thought I would like. She was right, Carol. She usually was. The farmer's market starts back up in April. The library is 3 miles down the road, and I have already been twice, and the librarian there, a retired schoolteacher named Frances, has already started putting aside books she thinks I might like, which tells you something about what kind of town this is. The garden beds are still there, stakes and twine exactly where Carol could not have known they'd be, waiting for someone to figure out what to do with them. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to start with tomatoes because it seems right. Because you have to start somewhere. Because there's a long growing season ahead, and I have, it turns out, more time than I thought. Time that was given to me by someone who loved me carefully and completely and did not stop making arrangements on my behalf just because she ran out of time to be here for them. I'll do my best not to kill them,